Dear guests, warmly welcome to Oulu and to the Fulbright Arctic's Research in Action Symposium. I especially welcome the researchers from the Fulbright Arctic Initiative program who come from different member states of the Arctic Council. We are delighted to hear your presentations this afternoon. This beautiful winter gives you a perfect opportunity to exchange knowledge as well as to observe the environment of two different latitudes in Finland, in Helsinki and now in Oulu. Here in Oulu, we have snow on the ground at least 160 days a year on average. We enjoy winter and quick access to nature and wilderness. However, we have a feeling that the weather varies a lot and extreme conditions are more frequent than earlier, even here. The effects of global warming are dramatic in Arctic region, and we are committed to find solutions to protect the Arctic. The slogan of university is science with Arctic attitude. We support the Arctic in all fields of expertise. Our expertise covers, among others, sustainable use of natural resources, aeronomy and atmospheric chemistry, technologies for extreme conditions and sparsely populated areas, health in northern environments, as well as national responsibility over education and research in Sami language and culture. The University of Oulu is a strong home base and supporter of Arctic research. The successful research is based on strong partnerships. This symposium and the visit of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative are very important to us. The Fulbright Finland Foundation is an important partner for us, also in terms of internationalization. Over the years, we have welcomed about 60 American Fulbright scholars. Around 30 of our students, researchers and teachers have taken part in the Fulbright scholarship programs. We thank you for this cooperation and wish it to continue successfully also in the future. Once more, welcome to Oulu and Oulu University. And now it's my pleasure to invite CEO Terhi Mölsä from Fulbright Finland Foundation to give her opening remarks. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Arctic colleagues, coinciding with the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council, the 2018-2019 Fulbright Arctic Initiative brings together a cohort of 16 established researchers, early career specialists, and indigenous knowledge experts from the 8 Arctic Council member states to form a network of scholars to conduct research in 2 broad focus areas: resilient communities and sustainable economies. In 2016, the Fulbright Finland Foundation organized the midterm plenary week in Finland for the 2015-16 inaugural Fulbright Arctic Initiative Scholar Cohort. And we are so pleased to now welcome the second Scholar Cohort to Finland for their midterm plenary. And here to Oulu for the Fulbright Arctic Symposium, organized in collaboration with the University of Oulu. I want to invite all of you to join in this dialogue to address shared challenges. The Arctic is facing profound social, economic, and environmental change, and communities are increasingly confronted with critical policy challenges related to issues of health and wellness, indigenous rights, energy resources, environmental protection, sustainability, infrastructure, education, and regional governance. The social and economic impacts of rapid environmental changes and globalization in the Arctic demand new research approaches and greater public participation. We need specialists across fields to join forces to come up with new solutions to challenges that do not recognize the traditional disciplinary divides of academia. Furthermore, we need to bridge the gap between academia and policy, and between science and the general public and media. We need to speak in a language that is mutually understandable. For its part, the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, in an unapologetically ambitious effort, strives to bridge these divides. Today, for the first time, as a full cohort, our Arctic scholars present their ongoing work to the public. And I encourage everyone here and through our live streaming throughout the world to join the dialogue. At the heart of the Fulbright mission is bringing people together, bridging divides, and extending beyond traditional boundaries. Since its inception, our own Finnish-American program in 1949, well over 5,500 grantees have pushed the boundaries of science and research on topics ranging from bioethics to preserving the Arctic. Fulbright Finland is based on a cooperative network of governmental partners, universities, research institutions, foundations, and other organizations, alumni and individual citizens who all join their forces, and I quote the Fulbright Finland vision, to empower the minds that will find global solutions to tomorrow's challenges by fostering academic and professional expertise and excellence in leadership. True to the Fulbright spirit, the organization of this Arctic Week and the symposium has been a joint effort. I want to convey our deep appreciation to the numerous individuals and organizations whose support and expertise we have relied on along the way. A special thank you to the Finnish and US governments for their support for the foundation, and to the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs of the US Department of State for their sponsorship of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative program, IIE for their collaboration, the incredible Fulbright Finland Foundation team for their dedication and tireless work. And for today, our sincere thank you to the University of Oulu and our host city of Oulu. 2019 is the Fulbright Finland Foundation's 70th anniversary year, and we're celebrating it under our brand promise, together shaping the future. I can't think of a better slogan also describing the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Fulbright Finland Foundation, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Fulbright Arctic Symposium. Tervetuloa. And I'm so pleased to now give the floor to the Vice President for Research of the University of the Arctic, Professor Arja Rautio.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Arctic, dear colleagues, this is a great pleasure for me to be here today and also have the possibility to tell you something what I understand about collaboration and working together over the Arctic region. I have been now working 13 years in the field of the Arctic research and education. And I have had a very nice opportunity to look at from different positions what is happening and what I see what is perhaps coming in the future. And I think that the importance of international collaboration and research is more and more important now than it has been earlier. My topics today, I tell you something about the University of Arctic, which is really working in the whole Arctic region, and also have the members from non-Arctic countries also. About the Arctic Council, which was already mentioned here, and some research projects which are very difficult to saying if they are multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, so that they have also the many fields together. And in those all, they have the international collaboration. And the science policy and communication, that's really important, and we need to do that. And what is Arctic family? So that first about the University of Arctic. We have at the moment 203 members. They are of higher education institutes and other organizations. And as I already mentioned, they are Arctic members and also non-Arctic. And the research, education and developmental activities are on the focus. But the most important issue is to give the voice to the indigenous people, to the local people who are living here, so that that's really the ground of the all work. And of course, we want to be relevant to the Arctic Council working groups and all the other organizations with the science and development. In the University of Oulu, we have thematic networks and research alliance office in Thule Institute. Another research office is in Arkhangelsk in the Northern Arctic Federal University. And in Oulu, we are, of course, in university helping and networking the Arctic projects and education issues. In national level, of course, during the Finnish chairmanship, we have participating many special groups, and in international way, we are working, of course, in Arctic Council, European Polar Board, International Arctic Science Committee, and many others. And this work we tried also to have the possibilities to have more and more research which is over the borders, the whole circumpolar region. The research projects and networks which are now going on are Interact, EU PolarNet and NorthArctic, which has been very successful. And here you see a lot of thematic networks. You can find everything, everyone can find something which is fitting to you. And I think that this thematic network is a gold mine for us, so that there are thousands of active researchers from different countries, and there's a lot of activities, and we can also find collaboration there. And one word about this Interact project, international network for terrestrial research and monitoring in the Arctic. There are altogether more than 80 research stations where you can go and have sampling, or you can also, from the human science or social scientists, can be collecting the interviews and data. And now this is my favorite map. So that the Arctic, half of the Arctic is Russia. And we cannot talk anything about the circumpolar north if we don't have also something from Russia. And 2/3 of the Arctic population is living in Arctic Russia. And I think that my main issue in all my work is so that if I could work in that way, that all the Arctic are jointly together. But it is not so easy in many ways, but I think that we have had also very nice promotion in that field. In the Arctic, there are many challenges, of course. Tourism is coming. People are in the pressure of the many different things when the climate is changing and permafrost is melting. But I think that one of the issues which is important to us is to collaborate and see what is happening in different regions. This research which I'm now telling is the northern Norway, northern Finland and the northern Sweden and Kola Peninsula. There's one result of the life expectancy in different countries, so that in these northern municipalities in Russia, they have not been so much increase in life expectancy during the 23 years. Now the situation is going a little bit better, but it has been rather poor condition. We have in Finland, Sweden and Norway, we have the increase in life expectancy. And as you see, it's a very small area, but the many issues are having effects so that the results are not so good in Russian side. Some words about the Arctic Council. Arctic Council is forming 8 countries and 6 permanent participant organizations, and there are 2 groups which are almost all is focusing on the environmental issues, an Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program and Sustainable Development Working Group. They have also so-called human dimension. In SDBG, there is a socio-economical working subgroup and also health group. Now I tell some of the projects which we have managed to do in a whole circumpolar area, so that all 8 countries are involved. And one important is mental wellness. During the 2 years when I have been leading this AHAC group during the Finnish chairmanship, there have been focus on digital storytelling and also conference concerning implementation of suicide prevention activities. In this project, all the Arctic countries are not involved, but at least we have representatives of all of them. Another one, One Arctic, One Health, which is I was leading together with Antti Oksanen from food authorities in Finland. We have working in a different way, so that we have tours, we have tabletop exercise, and also the examples of this tabletop exercise. They are like a transboundary disease outbreak and grounding a ship and a disease outbreak, so that they are not only health issues, they are something more bigger field. Important issue in the Arctic discussion and research is indigenous research ethics. And one project under this Arctic Human Health Expert Group has been ethical guidelines for Sami health, and it was made by Sami Council. And I think that the ethical discussion is not closing in this. It's something which is needed to be in every research and every step our work in the Arctic. I think that it's always important, but especially in the Arctic populations which are so small, and we have people are so tired about the researchers if we don't focus on that. And the very long-lasting, which has been running, is the international circumpolar surveillance, and I think that it's one part of the One Health. And perhaps you are now thinking what One Health means. One Health means the health of the environment, wildlife, and humans. And it's putting together environmental health, ecology, veterinary medicine, public health, human medicine, and health economics. And I think that under this umbrella we have also the mental wellness. And at the moment it's that kind of approach which can put different disciplines more closely together. And I think that we need that kind of approaches more and more. And this is the reasons why One Health is important, so that it is giving information what is happening in the Arctic. It is multidisciplinary, and it has also the connections to the rest of the world. And one important issue is that it has the approach of the community-based participatory research, so that we are taking those people who are living in the region, indigenous and non-indigenous, together to have already planning the research. And also we can have a voice to the people. Research ethics and guidelines, they are important. And as I said, indigenous knowledge and the issue which Terhi already mentioned, we need to talk with the policymakers. We need to make our message so that people can understand what we are doing, so that we have these many layers in our work when we are researchers. But I know, I'm not so good in that. These are some of the results of very recent papers when we were studying the infectious diseases in the Arctic region. And when we have the information from all this circumpolar region, and in this case we had the information also the Russian language scientific papers, we can see what is the situation, what are the main concerns in the different countries. My concern was so that in Greenland and Iceland there were no publications. I don't believe that during the 1970 up to 2017 there should be publications. But of course that may be a language issue, so that they have publications their own language, and that's why we have not all papers in our hands when we are looking at the situation. It also gives the information that some of the countries or some of the publications they are concerning, like in Russia, zoonotic or vector-borne diseases, and in some other they have the different kind of profile. And when we know that these diseases, they are not stopping to the borders, they are just going around. And it's also important to know that what is the amount of this type of the informations, climate change and infectious diseases. In the Arctic area, there are, in this pie, there's 8%, so that I don't know if it is big or small, but at least it's seen. It's the same amount than in Eastern Asia. Then I tell a little bit about one of the EU projects, Permafrost and the changing Arctic coast. And it's focusing on the science for socio-economical adaptation. We have around 20 partners, and the budget is around 11.5 million euros, and it's running for 5 years. And the groups are physical science, they are permafrost researchers or water researchers, and then there are a social science part, which is health and pollution, coastal infrastructure, natural resources, and economy. And in this community planning, there is a technology inside. And then we need to make an integration. But the important point is here, so that the EU wanted to have especially ethics to be included, and community-based participatory approach is one of the methods we are using. But this project is really difficult, so that we need to combine our knowledge, we need to learn our words in the same way. But we are going forward. This is our second year, and we have already very nice results. I'm leading the working package 5, which is health and pollution. We have already published 2 papers, and we are continuing about risk assessment, modeling of anthrax, and going to the mental health aspects. But we are going to that topic to having a quality of life, not to the asking about suicides, but at going like that. We need to have a joint interview guide and questionnaires, because it's no way that 10 researchers are asking the same question or different questions from the same persons. So, and that is a challenging, how we can make these schedules working. And I think that this is a very old picture, but I think that is still working very well. When we are talking about the things which are concerning the populations or humans, there are a lot of different things which have the quality of life and living conditions. They are the physical issues around, but they are also industries, politics, societies, and economical things. And in that way, when we are talking about community and the health or well-being aspects, it's included in all research. What is going? What the people are doing. And then this is a big issue for me, so that in Finland there has been established 20 years ago NorthArctic Institute, and it is led by Aalto University in Finland. And they have made a proposal to the European Union to have a think tank project. And it means that we are telling our results in that way that the policymakers can have the message. And as you know that policy brief papers, they are 2 or 3 pages only. And that's our task for the next 3 years. The themes are healthy aging, it's transport, environment, especially black carbon, and culture. And we have also decided yesterday, when we have the kickoff, that we are also making the workshop together, so that we can make the policy papers together. And I think that that's a huge possibility for us to learn a lot. We also give education to the researchers, having workshop and short courses, so that having this idea and elements more into the research world. The partners, of course, they are Aalto University, the coordinator, NARFU, St. Petersburg State University of Economics, International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and University of Oulu. And this Northern Dimension Institute there is altogether 11 countries, so that Nordic countries and then the Baltic Sea countries. So there's a lot of different types of the cultures, and also Russia is one of the member of that institute. And then I think that this is my somehow conclusion, so that how to be a member of the International Arctic Research family. I feel that it is a family. We are not so many. So that I think that to be a student in the international programs, of course the universities, but of course University of Arctic is also one of the very good opportunity for that. Fulbright, excellent opportunity. And the person who was making that infectious diseases article, the first author, Audrey White, she came for a Fulbright student to Oulu. So that I have that kind of connection in that also. So, and also the students, there's a lot of masters and PhD summer and field school, courses and schools. And like you now here, Fulbright scholars, you are having your own network. And the students, they can build that network very early, so that when they are in a connection with the other countries, the students coming from the other countries or other disciplines, it gives a totally different start for the career in a research and whatever expertise they are doing. So I very much and strongly support the idea to focus on young researchers and young students. Okay, and then as a researcher, it is in the Arctic project, and there are a lot of funding also available, Nordic Council of Ministers, EU, and in our conference of One Arctic, One Health, there were also nice support from the National Science Foundation for 24 participants, also to participate conferences, seminars, workshops, and I think that the Arctic Council is also a very good opportunity. International Arctic Science Committee and Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, APEX, so that kind of things there are possibility to also learn it very early in career. And I think that the most important is you must be curious, active, and don't be afraid when going forward to new approaches and new adventures. So thank you very much.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Sprague. I'm at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and along with my colleague Ross Virginia from Dartmouth College, we have the esteemed honor to be co-lead scholars for the Fulbright Arctic Initiative for the second time. We both led the first Fulbright Arctic Initiative, which was a complementary program of the U.S. chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and now it's very nice to have another Fulbright Arctic Initiative at the very same time and complementary to the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council. It was a lovely setup, these presentations this morning, because many of the issues that were discussed were the very issues that have occurred and teased out during the first Fulbright, but here in more depth and possibly more challenging, the second Fulbright Arctic Initiative. So some of our work here has been done in terms of setting a foundation, but we're going to build upon it this afternoon. So let me thank the University of Oulu once again for being our home, not just for a lovely welcome, but for being a place that informs and has influenced our work. To the Fulbright Finland Foundation and Terhi's fantastic team, again, I think there is a stream running through Oulu University, the Fulbright Finland Foundation, and the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. Our roots actually are with the University of the Arctic, yet another theme. Both Ross and I co-lead one of the research centers for the Fulbright, for the University of the Arctic, and that is focused on the Institute of Arctic Policy, the very first institute for the University of the Arctic. From that relationship, and in Finland and in the United States, came a relationship between Dartmouth and my former University of Alaska Fairbanks, and now through the Woodrow Wilson Center. From that relationship and the work done was built an idea that was complemented by the State Department that turned into the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. So there's a stream between the U-Arctic and Fulbright and many of the research networks around the circumpolar north. So let me thank Terhi and her team, the Fulbright Finland Foundation, the State Department, this lovely town, and this great institution. I also want to highlight the individual work that is done by not just our scholars, but the team and those that support the teams at Fulbright, particularly David Yokin. David, could you please just raise your hand, stand up? David. Thank you. And now let me tell you a little bit more why you clapped for him. Because David is the vice chair of the Fulbright Finland Foundation. He's also a dear friend of not just the Fulbright Finland program, but of all Fulbright, and a Fulbright alum. David is also a senior lecturer of art at the Arts Academy at Turku University of Applied Sciences. So this is someone who supports Fulbright in this country, supports Fulbright globally, and is not beyond moving posters, tables, and setting up chairs. David, you epitomize what Fulbright does globally and locally. Thank you for everything you do for us. A reminder of who we are and where we come from. The circumpolar north looks different these days. Unfortunately in some places, maybe fortunate in others, but we are people of the north, and that's the work that's before us. What does the future of the people of the north look like? Because after all, we're talking about communities, not just a landscape. We're talking about community connection to a landscape. And if a landscape changes, people change. And all of the implications with that change, as Terhi pointed out, the social, political, economic, and the landscape changes that occur. who better to address the changes than the Fulbright program? And who better than 16 scholars that have come together at the second round to look at the Fulbright, as we were just challenged, not in silos of research, but integrated research in an interdisciplinary approach. So we try to remind ourselves who we are, why we are, and who we serve. We serve the people of the North at an incredibly dynamic time. So our Fulbright scholars don't just share a vision, they do. They don't just share a mission, they do. But they also share a sense of urgency that you've heard about, and you will hear about quite spotlighted this afternoon. This sense of urgency is not because it's an academic exercise, it's because the people we serve simply need us to have a sense of urgency, and you will hear that over and over. You'll also hear a lot about themes. Some of the themes were carried over from the first Fulbright program. They're no more or less important, but the sense of urgency has sped up quite quickly. So we represent 8 nations, 16 scholars, and Ross and I have the pleasure of leading them. Multiple disciplines because that's what's required. You don't just need an engineer to figure out what the future of the Arctic will look like and how structures are built. You need the social scientists, the economists, and so forth. You need the full team to take care of the complex issues that the Arctic faces. We have broken ourselves out in 2 thematic networks and then crosswalked these networks, and you'll hear more about that as well. We've done that quickly over 10 months with just 8 to go. These are our scholars. This is the lens through which we have done our work. We've identified common objectives and common goals. I won't go into them because you'll hear that thread throughout the afternoon. We've made it now, I guess, part of our program, first to go to Canada with the support of the Canadian Fulbright program, this time to Ottawa, but twice now to Iqaluit, a northern community that struggles just like many northern communities. And the work that you will hear about has been filtered through the lens of that community. You cannot be in that community for a few days to not feel what is happening there, the good and the not so good, and that's experienced throughout the North. So Iqaluit has been our filter twice now through the Fulbright program. These Fulbrights are not just the traditional Fulbrights where you do your work and you go on exchange somewhere. You do that, so that's one Fulbright. We also ask these Fulbrighters to do a second, and that is to work within a team, an interdisciplinary team, and maybe the first time they've worked across disciplines. And then we ask for a third of them, and that is to work across the 2 thematic teams. So really, this is 3 in 1 over 18 months. It's a lot of work, but that's what the sense of urgency does to scholars of the North. So, our afternoon is broken out into 2 phases. You're going to hear individual programs by individual scholars, and then you'll hear group presentations. So let me first introduce our first speaker on his first work, and that's Shaun Kostina from the Nunavut Arctic College in Canada. Please welcome Shaun to the podium.
Thank you, Mike. I'm just going to move. I'm going to mitigate risk and just in case I get animated. A huge thank you to University of Oulu, the city of Oulu, the constellation of folks who have put all this together, Fulbright Canada, Fulbright, the State Department, IIE, and Fulbright Finland. And especially my fellow Fulbrighters. This constellation of people has created such incredible momentum and meaning, and my work has become that much more meaningful thanks to the passion of all the folks I have the honor to work with. So thank you. I am a hunter and gatherer of a digital sort. Sorry, I'm just going to hit my clock quickly so I don't... So I come from Nunavut, as Mike mentioned, in the eastern Arctic of Canada. Nunavut is both the youngest political territory and the largest. So I have a lot of hunting and gathering of archival materials to do. My work is not that sophisticated. I chase, I find stuff. But the biggest part of my process is in building relationships. And I've started in building relationships with regards to archives within Nunavut, and over time, and especially with the injection of this Fulbright energy, those networks and that relationship building has gone across Canada, into the States, and across into Western Europe as well. I just want to quickly make two statements about archives and the way in which I'm working, the lens through the way I see archives. Firstly, archives is about the future. As Terry said, shaping the future. If you think of Noah's Ark, the Ark was built not about the past, but it was about the future. So I'm always imagining archives in a future sense, not in a past sense. Secondly is that archives need, a territory or a region, in my case a territory, needs to hold its own archive. If it doesn't hold its own archive, it's less able to tell its stories, do its own research, do its own advocacy, create its own literature. So I just want to set up that frame before I move on. The problem we have in Nunavut is a lack of access to archival materials. We're a very young territory, as I mentioned. We don't hold our own archive. Our government archive is held in Ottawa and Winnipeg. So Nunavummiut do not have access to their archival materials. Secondly, historically, the Arctic, the Eastern Arctic, has been a very active and a very busy place. Explorers, whalers, churches, corporations have done work there, tons of work, and all that documentation has gone somewhere. It's gone back to institutions, it's held by families and individuals all over the world. So there's a wealth of archival materials pertaining to Nunavut in institutions around the world, meaning we don't have access to that in Nunavut. So through this work, it's about not imagining Nunavut as this empty space, as a vast open space. It's a very peopled space and historically a lot of action. So by collecting more and more archival materials, it's about creating an intellectual infrastructure for Nunavummiut and other people to be able to do deeper research and take deeper dives for context, which my group will speak a bit about later. So here's the work about building relationships. My pulsing thing here matches Washington, D.C. So my research exchange will be to the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian in Washington. And what the folks there are going to help me to do is make more connections to archival holdings in the northeast of the States. So there's a lot of work there around whaling and explorers and scientific data that is held by institutions. As well, making more connections. These are a lot of things I've already done in parts of Canada, in Nuuk, in Los Angeles, and over to Western Europe, where there's a lot of whaling archival materials and a lot of oblate priest Catholic missionary materials. So the work is a digital return, because we don't have the ability to, I can't hold this stuff, this physical stuff. So it's about returning things to Nunavut communities through digital means. So ultimately, we're creating this network, this intellectual network premised on archival materials. So this is about creating conditions for deeper research locally, for communities to have access to materials, to drive their own research, to create new areas of research, to advocate. This is for students, this is for writers, to be able to do deeper dives. And speaking of deeper dives, that's a basement I was in 3 weeks ago in Toronto. I get to dive into basements and find stuff like this. And ultimately, it's about returning this to the community. This is all from Pond Inlet. It's missing ice data that people have never seen. So I'll leave it on that note, and I would like to introduce my colleague from the North Slope of Alaska, Nicole. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Shaun. That was great. Welcome. I will be discussing my individual project, which was on food access and telecommunications. We enjoyed fantastic food here, so thank you for the hospitality. I am from a community called Barrow, or Karvik. It's a community of about 4,500 people. It's the northernmost point in the United States and lies around 71 degrees north. It's an Inuit community, and Inuit live across the northern region of Alaska, Chukotka, Canada, and Greenland. I work for the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management, which is a municipal home rule government, and one of only about 3 counties in the US have such a department. So just having a department like this shows how important our living natural resources are to us that we depend on, such as marine mammals, caribou, and birds. In Nordkarvik, we depend on hunting and harvesting wild animals and plants, and there's little to no opportunity for agriculture. Here you can see the sharing of the bowhead whale with the entire community, and we have many customs surrounding the whale. And a lot of my work supports Indigenous rights to food security. Inuit communities have always been a trading people to sustain a way of life and thrive. So the title of my individual project highlights Kotnut, which is a festival in Northwest Alaska. And it's a time for trading, connecting among Inuit, and has been done for centuries. So communication among our people has always been important, and exchange of foods and goods has always been there. So how can we maintain our communications, sharing, and food security and access to food into the future? Food in the grocery stores is terribly expensive, so what are the policies necessary to improve this? Are there innovative technological solutions? My project attempts to delve into this complex issue, but one so real to our communities. I chose to go to Iceland to conduct some background research at the University of Iceland, and then I went off to Selfoss, which is a smaller community outside of Reykjavik. I went to Iceland to look into the communications tools and food security initiatives and how they may be applied to other places, including those in the initial phases of access to telecom technologies. So when I went there, I discussed Arctic telecommunications development with people in the industry, and they seem to think that this will happen naturally and organically. But here's a map above of the deep sea cables that allow for broadband connection, and you may see a startling gap across the Arctic. We are part of developed states, including the US, Canada, Nordic countries, but there has been no real investment in broadband and satellite connections in our region. Why? So right now in Finland, they're making the case that investing in broadband will improve and help the agricultural industry. So during my first week in Iceland and our Arctic Circle, I also heard about the need for broadband as one of the top issues to Arctic mayors. So I'm doing my research to discover even the smallest things that can make big differences in our communities. And as a result of what I learned from my time abroad, I am now looking at food access as risk-based on the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework after learning about it at the Earthquake Engineering Research Center in Selfoss, and drafting a paper on indigenous marine mammal use and the rights associated with this. So, Koyanak, and now Jose will speak.
Well, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to address you this afternoon. I identify myself as a northerner by birth. I grew up in a small mining town in northern Quebec, where access to healthcare was really challenged by geography, weather, and the scarcity of population, and was involved with my family that was politically engaged in the repatriation of healthcare system away from corporation, mining companies, or congregation, the churches, and putting them into a public system. So at the back of part of my history, if you want, is a real curiosity of how we design healthcare system for northern complex environment where density of population create a real barrier, but also where indigenous cultures, voices in those system design have historically been marginalized or trivialized. And I've been thinking about a framework to help me organize my thought around healthcare system design. And of course, circumpolar countries have now embraced this framework of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We are all signatory of this particular framework. And Article 23 gives me some sort of ground in which to anchor my study, because it talks about the right of Indigenous people to determine their own priorities and strategies in the context of healthcare, but also in terms of determining the healthcare system itself. So I'm at the beginning of my exchange. I've had the opportunity to spend only 1 week in Alaska, and I'll be returning in April. So this is sort of a developmental presentation, if you want. And I'll have the privilege of engaging with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, of which the South Central Foundation is one component. So the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium is one of the most comprehensive model that I will have the opportunity to study, and I have spent some time across Canada studying northern healthcare systems. I've spent time in Australia, New Zealand, and Norway, and in Colombia as well. And so I'll be embedded in this particular study in terms of this cross-national framework. It is a very exciting model, and you have now a picture of the medical center that is co-managed by the consortium and South Central Foundation. It is a state-of-the-art medical facility that operates along Indigenous values, a really unique model. And as to give you sort of a point of reference for a Nordic context, I've had the opportunity to go to Sansk, which I'm told I'm not pronouncing well, but I think you understand what I mean. And Sansk is really a much more focused model, if you want, of what I'll be looking at in Alaska, because it is a Sami-centric mental health or mental health facility, if you want, where Sami can go and access services in their own language. It was imagined to be much more cultural grounded, but there has been some compromise in the design over time. And it's located in northern Norway, and I'm told that Sami from Finland are supported to go there if they wish to access services in their own language, but there is nothing really equivalent in Finland. So it's an interesting parallel, but it's at a much more pruned back scale. And so I was really happy to hear your comments about ethics, because a key piece of for researching these models is to embed themselves into the view of Indigenous people themselves. This is something that in Canada is strongly, well, it's not encouraged, it's enforced actually, that we have to partner with Indigenous communities to do this kind of work. In Alaska, it's encouraged to speak to those, to how we will engage as well. And of course, there's other models of ethical guidelines that are emerging that I understand are still under discussion here in Nordic countries, and I'll be exploring those different requirements to produce a sort of an international perspective on this. Thank you. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague, Elizabeth Rink from Montana State University.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you about sexual and reproductive health, which is near and dear to my heart and not always the easiest topic to talk about in front of a group. So I appreciate your comfort and warm smiling faces. So my name is Elizabeth Rank, and I'm a professor of community health at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. And I've been working in Greenland for the past 13 years on sexual and reproductive health. And I did not grow up thinking I would be a researcher in Greenland on sex, basically. But about 13 years ago, I was giving a talk about the importance of community-based participatory research with Indigenous communities to understand the very sensitive topic of sexual and reproductive health. And in the audience during my discussion were two Danish doctors who work in Greenland, and they invited me to Greenland to start my research, and that launched my life in the Arctic. So if we look at sexual and reproductive health in Arctic communities, we find that in Indigenous communities in the Arctic, they experience poor reproductive health outcomes in comparison to non-Indigenous communities in the Arctic. And when we think about sexual and reproductive health disparities over time in communities, that can lead to decreased fertility. And decreased fertility hinders communities and people's ability and capacity to reproduce and to regenerate and to thrive. And when you see populations starting to die out, that obviously correlates to their cultures, their beliefs, and their practices also dying out. So there's a very crucial need to address the core essence of human reproduction in the Arctic. So in my work in Greenland, I'm not going to share with you all of the determinants of sexual reproductive health in a Greenlandic context, but some of the more poignant characteristics that are impacting sexual and reproductive health are volatile interpersonal relationships between sex partners, the strong influence of grandparents and how grandparents influence their children having children. We also see the legacy of historical trauma and colonialism still being played out in contemporary times. There is also a very strong connection to place and to the land. And as Mike talked about, when the landscape starts to change, people start to change. And that, in my research, leads to mental health issues, and depression and anxiety and stress are directly correlated to people's reproductive health practices and beliefs. And then we also see substance use as primarily alcohol use as an issue also, but that really is a secondary symptom to historical trauma and emotional trauma. So because my lens had only been a Greenlandic one for over a decade, I came to Finland and did my field work last fall in Utsjoki. And I was there to just learn about what the Sami people's perspective was of sexual and reproductive health. And what I found while I was there was a very clear emphasis on biomedical services and addressing the somatic issues that influence reproductive health. Where there were areas that were more challenging to tease out were gaps in how people look at culture and how cultural practices and beliefs are integrated into sexual and reproductive health services. And then also there was a very clear siloing of we work on mental health, we work on substance use, we work on reproductive health, but we don't integrate all of those together. I also found very strong community cohesion and community members taking care of each other outside of the formal institutions that are up in Utsjoki. And a very beautiful example of that was an elder Sami man that I interacted with who would take it upon himself to go meet with younger Sami male reindeer herders when he would get wind or hear of them having some sort of relationship issues or problems in their marriage or with their children, so that he could provide them with emotional support to help to try and mitigate any negative outcomes that might influence that family unit or that relationship that would then in turn impact the reproductive health of that family. So I want to thank my wonderful hosts, who I just adore, Heidi Erickson, who is a physician up in Utsjoki, and then Aria Rocio, who you've already met. I refer to them as goddesses of the Arctic, and they truly are two of the most amazing women I've ever worked with and interacted with. And then I also want to thank the community of Utsjoki. They opened me up with very warm arms, and I was able to participate in their reindeer separations and have lots of very wonderful conversations with them. Thank you. So I am now going to introduce Sanna Larsen from Denmark, who does research in Greenland.
Yes, thank you. So now on to something very different, because I'm an engineer, and I work for the Danish Center for Environmental Assessment at Aalborg University in Denmark. And part of my research has been in Greenland, which is sort of my Arctic link, even though I don't live in the Arctic. And I want to just briefly talk about sort of the main idea behind my research. We talked about my mission with this, and a little bit about my Arctic experience with Fulbright. So I deal with impact assessment. What we are trying to do is we are trying to assess and mitigate impacts of any proposed activity that goes on, both on the environment and on people. And we want that knowledge to be input for decision-making process. We're deciding whether to go ahead or approve an activity or not. And ultimately, the goal is to try to be part of making a sustainable development. Then the trouble with that is that when we're dealing with plans, things that haven't gone ahead yet, and trying to assess the impacts of this, then we're dealing with the future. And the future is a tricky thing. It is inherently uncertain. And this uncertainty, when we look at impact assessment, can be in many things. It can be in what exactly is going to be the design or the technology that we're going to use in this activity. Do we have uncertainty about data? Do we have uncertainty when we then analyze data in terms of the models we use or the calculations we use? There can also be uncertainty about secondary consequences. One thing are the consequences very close to the activity, but the further we get in thinking about them, they become more uncertainty. We're also dealing with people, or at least society, and we are also tricky beings, because we tend to maybe change our minds every now and then. So in terms of like, what are the values, the things we prioritize now, will that be the same in the future? And then, of course, all these outside trends. We've talked about some of the major global trends going on in the Arctic. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge for impact assessment. And I mean, I said I'm an engineer. We tend to be fairly square people. So this uncertainty is really a challenge to many of the people that I interact with. And then we're dealing with the Arctic, and it's, at least in my head, it's a fairly dynamic region. It's a region developing. We see a lot of environmental trends, but also social trends, and a possibility, at least in some places, of these economic activities. We're talking about resource extraction. We're talking about maybe opening up for new shipping possibilities, tourism, and so on. So a lot of things are going on. And my big question is, how do this impact assessment that's supposed to give us knowledge about impacts of something we might do, how do we deal with these challenges of uncertainty when we look at the Arctic? And there are two questions at least. There's one about whether we acknowledge the uncertainty. Do we, when we assess impacts, say, okay, these are the impacts that we predict, there is some uncertainty, and you decision makers and you, the public, need to know this when you make a decision. And the second question is, if we get that far, is it dealt with somehow? Do we have some sort of, I'm an engineer, tools or approaches to dealing with it, analyzing it or trying to handle it some way? Those are my kind of two big questions, and I don't have answers yet. Maybe I'll never entirely have answers, but at least from what I've seen now, I mean, the first sort of results is that there's very little in what I've seen so far where we actually deal with these things. So that's my mission. Then a little bit about the Fulbright exchange. I went to Anchorage in Alaska, and I was with the University of Alaska in Anchorage, the Institute for Social and Economic Research. And it really is a wonderful chance to get to compare across the Arctic. Because there are so many links. It's also when I say, you know, the work I've seen so far, we're not very good at dealing with this. A lot of the work that's been done looks at the documents. So it takes the EIA report and it goes through it and says it doesn't say anything about uncertainty. But there could be lots of things that go on in the decision-making process that are not in the documents. So it's really, for me, it's a chance to travel and speak to people and go beyond these documents. For me, as someone not living in the Arctic, it's also been a great chance of getting more understanding of the region and beyond Greenland where I've worked, but also, especially, of course, Alaska. So, with that, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll leave the floor to Todd Swarmer from Barrow, Alaska.
Okay, my individual project really focused on the following problem. We can do this correctly here. Oh, right here. What you see here is nakalak. This is the Inupiaq word for a name for broad whitefish. And what you're seeing, this is a large, very important subsistence fish. What you see, these fungal-like patches, is the result of an infection by the freshwater mold called Saprolegnia parasitica. So just to give you a little bit more of a context, I, like Nicole, live in Utqiagvik or Barrow, Alaska. You can see from there. But the mold is actually taking effect in Nuiqsut, which is approximately this location. So it's a town or a village of about 400 people on the edge of the Colville River that empties into the Beaufort Sea. I had the really great opportunity to conduct an experiment, both quantitative and qualitative, at the University of Victoria, right here, for my individual project. And so what's really going on here with this mold is that in the last week of September in 2013, our Department of Wildlife Management, received a number of calls from fishermen, complaining of a real diseased fish. And so Billy Adams, a subsistence specialist in our department, and I had the chance to go to Nuiqsut and interview fishermen, take water samples, fish samples, but also meet with some of the local people, native village of Nuiqsut, Kukpikmiut Subsistence Oversight Panel, the for-profit Kukpik Corporation, and they actually wanted us to, figure out what this is, why it's occurring now, and possibly how to get rid of it. At the same time, or a few years after that, we also received direction from local fishermen who wanted to know if water temperatures increase, how might that affect the spread or the rate of spread of this mold. So I was able to do, as I said, this experiment at the University of Victoria. And it was basically a factorial design of temperature and salinity. We used 4 different levels of temperature and 3 levels of salinity. And what you're seeing here, if I can do, What you're seeing here are these just regular agar plates, and we just put the mold right in the center there. And each day I'd come and take a look at and measure or trace the area. And so this blue line right here represents the same time as this one. So you begin to see that there is an effect of temperature, salinity, or some interaction. And that's how we're quantifying this. And again, and we also were asked to talk about this Fulbright experience. One of the things, as soon as I got the fellowship, our department really wanted to capitalize on this. So they invested in bringing up the person I would be working with at the University of Victoria, Dr. Paul de la Bastide. He brought him to Barrow, and then we traveled to Nuiqsut, where we hired a local boat and fishermen to take us down some of the rivers and collect water samples and fish samples, just to give him a better context of what we were doing and the ease or difficulty of getting samples. So this is him in the lab in Barrow. This also led to our ability to talk to the school in Nuiqsut, but also in Victoria to talk about sampling procedures. So we have 3 plans for sampling, hopefully at least do one of them this summer. The other context is that, the greater colleagues within this group has really had a chance to open this up to a greater area rather than just northern Alaska. And the good news is that the mold is not circumpolar, at the moment at least, and so that's good news, but it also showed us that there is really a lack of baseline understanding of whether the mold is present in these other circumpolar areas or not. And so we are also making plans or trying to find proposals to write for this kind of sampling in a larger context. And again, this does relate to the sustainable economies and resilient communities. So with that, thank you very much. And I get to introduce my Russian colleague, Svetlana Tulaeva.
Thank you, Todd. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Svetlana. I'm from Russia, from St. Petersburg. And my project is devoted to the governance instruments which are implemented and elaborated by state authorities, corporations, international organizations to increase sustainability of local communities in the Arctic. And so I did my research exchange at the Arctic program at Bowdoin College in Maine, and it was my first time at the American University, so it was a great experience for me. It gave me some theoretical insights and helped to improve my research project and to collect some materials. So as for my project, the main goal of my research, the main question of my research is how different governance instruments influence the sustainability of local communities in the Arctic regions. And I focused on different aspects of governance, such as formal rules and formal regulations. Also, I analyzed different governance structures, such as associations, partnerships, councils, and so on. And also I focused on decision-making procedures and some social programs aiming at the increase in sustainability of local communities. I compared my Russian experience, and regional mitigation strategy for National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. I used my interviews from Russian regions with the state authorities, indigenous communities, and oil corporations, and also I analyzed transcripts, available transcripts from public meetings in Alaska. And I indicated several main types of agreements between corporations and the indigenous communities which are actually implemented in Russian regions and in Alaska. It is informal agreements and sponsorship which were very popular in Russian regions 10 years ago. It is formal compensations and some partnership agreements which are widespread now in Alaska and in Russia, and also it is distribution of shares which is typical only for Alaska. And I analyzed positive and negative aspects of these different types of agreements and how they influence on local communities and how local people can use it to increase their adaptive capacities. So my next step now is to convert this academic knowledge into policy, in some policy recommendations. So that's all briefly about my project, and now I'm glad to introduce my colleague, Lara, Johan's daughter from University of Iceland.
Thank you, Svetlana, and good afternoon. Yes, the topic of my talk today is sustainable economies, risks, and the role of insurance companies. Okay. My Fulbright Arctic Initiative exchange was to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, where I was hosted by Professor Ross Virginia, which is sitting here on the stage, but he is a director of the Institute of Arctic Studies. But as you can see in the photos, this was also a family adventure. Taking part in this program has allowed me to become a better scholar in the sense that I have gained a deeper understanding of Arctic issues, but also due to the overall quality of the program. And the people, different scholars and people that I have discussed with along the way, and the truly interdisciplinary nature of the research and the networks that we are establishing. But before I discuss the cases that I am working on, I briefly present a framework that I'm using. It includes risks on different levels. It ranges from individual level of risks, such as for subsistence activities, but reaches up to the level of existential risks. The focus of my studies are on the systemic level of risks. But Arctic economic studies, they may also take into account the needs to, the institutional context needs to be taken into account, as well as social, cultural, and environmental context. And we also need to recognize that there are both monetized and non-monetized economies in the Arctic. So, turning to the first case, based on the frameworks that I am using in my study, the first case that I studied was oil spills. And this included the top 10 marine-related oil spills in the world. And the findings suggest that a systemic risk is usually not taken into account when risks of economic opportunities are being evaluated. What should be noted here is that an opportunity for the market economy might be a risk to the subsistence economy or vice versa. And that is why we need to take both of these types of economies into account. In my paper, it also highlights that the further economic development in the Arctic is expected to increase the likelihood of oil spills. Finding, they additionally suggest that oil spills may have social, cultural, economic, environmental consequences, and also cause implications to security and policy, in addition to have impact on businesses that cause the spills. What I also found out is that the insurance sector is already recognizing the risks on on this systematic level, but it is also clear that it's very hard to find examples of how they evaluate oil spill risks and how they compensate for these consequences. And the second case that I'm now working on focuses on cruise ship incidents. And what is interesting is that the sector doesn't talk about disasters, but incidents. I will also, in this case, place these findings in Arctic and the insurance context. And the questions that I will be dealing with in this case is, what are the types of significant cruise ship incidents? What are the consequences when such incidents occur? How might these consequences look like in the Arctic context? And what role might the insurance play in this regard? To conclude, recognizing risks on the scale that I am working on at least presents the first step to finding mitigating solutions and purposeful practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. So you've now met one half of this Fulbright cohort, and I think you're already observing the range of disciplines and expertise, the passion they have for the research, the places they've been, and I think the power of the international exchange experience and allowing them to think about new ideas, forming new partnerships. And these are all the things that they're now bringing here to Oulu. And this is really, these are the key ingredients of the working groups that we're going to hear from shortly after the break. So you also see the range of disciplines from public health to engineering to political science. And so what we'd like to do now is really open this up to you. Questions about their work, about the exchange, where this work is going, what's difficult about Fulbright, what's rewarding about Fulbright. All questions are good questions. So I'd like to encourage people in the audience to begin this dialogue. That's why we've come here, is to have a conversation. So if there are questions, we have a microphone here and we'll start. And they can be addressed to anyone or everyone.
Thank you. My question is, could you please discuss the assumptions that you think present the biggest obstacles to bringing people together to address the changes and challenges that you've been studying and researching in the Arctic?
Okay, is this working? Yeah. As a start, we all start from our own lens, from our own knowledge base, what we grew up, our own values. And of course, we develop a discipline, but to think that that discipline exists in isolation from our own context that's utopian. That simply does not exist. And so we begin our conversation from our own standpoint, realizing that we use words in very different way. And the first challenge of coming together from different contexts is to realize that when we use a word like resilience, that we don't mean the same thing, and some of us don't like the word at all. And I think our colleagues from the other group might have the same challenge with the word sustainability. And until we unpack those words and start understanding sort of the breadth of perspective, we can't even begin to communicate with each other. So that's the first start of coming together as a group.
Other comments from the group? Same question, even?
Yeah, coming from the other group, I just want to say that we have been struggling with the same type of challenge.
I would say, based on my own experience as a researcher in Greenland and then also working with our resilient community group, that the different Arctic nations have different governance policies, and those governance policies impact the indigenous peoples that a lot of us work with differently. And so there's different ways of understanding governances from the states, the countries, versus the governance of indigenous people, and sort of navigating those waters in ways that is respectful and doesn't create more distance and brings us together, and finding ways to have those conversations around difficult topics around indigenous rights versus the rights of the basically the dominant cultures in these different communities that we work with is a very, I think it's a big challenge for all of us.
Todd, did you want to say something?
I think another assumption, though, that I also brought to this was that when you're, in a Native community, that the voice would be 100% one way or the other, and of course that's never the case. So within a Native community, especially ones where there are for-profit corporations, there can be some very difficult discussions about what should or shouldn't be done even within the Native community. So that's something else that's a little bit an assumption probably I brought to this.
Can maybe add something from my own field. One of the things I didn't mention is that I've been working with indigenous and local knowledge as an input to impact assessment. I think that might be another assumption, like the talk about what is knowledge and can we broaden that? Especially when we talk about something like impact assessment that's so scientific in its basis. How can we sort of start talking about different kinds of knowledge, valid and useful knowledge?
I was just going to say briefly that just the term Arctic alone assumes one thing, but it's many, many things, and as well as in indigeneity is many different things in different places. So something our group, Thriving Communities Group, is focused on is really the contexts, the historical and cultural context specific to the different places where we live and do our work.
I would add that I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but this issue of resilient communities versus thriving communities will be a narrative now in publications. That's what will happen here. And I know the debate is happening elsewhere in the world, but Ross and I are responsible for shaping some of this, including the vocabulary that was used. But that's a good thing, because here it really is the way in which language and the wording means something in one particular discipline or one particular region might have a totally different implications somewhere else. But once it gets into the literature or the vernacular or it's in the conversation, then it becomes the box. It becomes the thing that we all repeat in our proposals, in our publications, in our narratives, in our conference titles. And here what you have seen is this evolution of a reality that there are different resilience ways in which you would say and think about resilience. This is a reflection of what Arctic communities are really are experiencing, and the way in which you are approaching work, because resilient doesn't quite fit this box. What fits better is the way in which communities have their rhythm, what they need, and how they thrive, versus just being resilient to a change as if they can do nothing about it.
Yeah, I think when we move to the session later on the group conversation, we'll see how important words are and how much time it takes to find a common vocabulary in order to shape research questions and to move forward in a collaborative way. So do we have another question from the audience?
I want to thank you so much for sharing your amazing research with us, all of you. A couple of quick questions. Shaun, the notion of the archive can be, much broader than anything that can be digitized, perhaps. And I'm just wondering if what you said about how the Nunavut don't have access to archives, and I assume their own archives. I assume by that you mean archive in the more conventional sense. But I'm wondering if part of the project, or if Nunavut folks also see this as a way of maybe combining that. I mean, are there other objects, practices, et cetera, that you might also consider part of the archive, and how do they interact with what you're creating? And then Jose, just a question of, given that indigeneity is such a broad thing, what does it look like, one of the health centers based on indigenous values? I'm just curious as to what that looks like. Thank you.
The answer is yes. So as I mentioned, what I'm doing now is pretty kind of on the ground work, just collecting and gathering. That's just the first, instinct was to just go find stuff. There's tons of work to do in terms of processes, one of which we've identified through the Fulbright process with my colleague Gwen is the process of ownership, questions of ownership, intellectual property, policy decisions that need to be made with regards to archives. Who owns them? If we're finding lots of stuff that they're disconnected to the people who originally either is in the archives or created them. So how do we deal with that? How do we make those things accessible when we don't have consent or waiver forms or people have passed on? So the very early stages work, because I do recognize that archival work in Nunavut is low on the priority list. More vitally in the territory is health, education, and housing. So this is a slow process, and I realize this is decades of work, and I'm in the kind of early stages. We're in the early stages of this. So I hope that addresses some. But the big part is the building relationships with and going outside our own institution.
It's a very interesting question you're asking, because of course, as soon as you say there's indigeneity is diversity, that I can't answer in one silo, so there's a tension there. But having said that, healthcare system, I've worked with an indigenous healthcare system for many years before I began doing research. And my general reflection is that as soon as the services are no longer government-driven or government offered, and to become part of the indigenous, if you want, governance structure, that it becomes, instead of being demand-driven, it becomes community-driven. And the difference is huge in terms of, if you think about going to see your doctor when you need care, as opposed to having a team of care that is saying, okay, well, we haven't seen so-and-so in 3 weeks, and we know that that person was injured or their kids are away and she's more isolated. That kind of dynamic where it's basically being part of the community and the family fabric, where that interest into the overall well-being of the person, those values are more likely to inform the model of care. And that's the ideal, at least, that the community organization, indigenous organization, seem to be striving for. May not always realize because of workforce scarcity, but that's the value that inform those models of care in a very general way.
Hi, this has been really interesting. I think this is maybe a question for Michael and Ross, which is, since so much of what you've been discussing involves terminology and relationships and voice and perspectives, I wondered about the role of the humanities as disciplinary perspectives to help you collectively deal with questions of memory and community and voice and culture. It seems like that would be an opportunity. Many of you are basically doing that, but whether you thought about bringing in yet more disciplines into this conversation.
Yes, we've thought about that, and in the previous round we did have an artist, someone from the arts, as part of the group. So some of this is about, who applies and how the teams are shaped. But we recognize the importance of all voices and all disciplines participating, and that includes the professions as well. So that is the goal and the foundation for this program, we have a team of 16 and it's hard to get everything in here. We have 13 disciplines represented in 16 individuals and 8 nations. So that's a lot. But I agree with you completely that the perspectives from the humanities, the human condition, history, the arts, performance, are all critical to understanding the future of the Arctic. And certainly I think Mike and I would both speak that it's our hope to keep that level of interdisciplinarity alive in the program. And I think that's a wonderful suggestion. We have people here from the State Department and other places that are very involved in the program. So speaking to the humanities is a good question.
And in some ways, we're limited by resource and time and the time scale. But I think that's why we really honored and valued the time that we had in Iqaluit. That's the very first time these scholars met. They met in Ottawa for a couple of days, but then went to Iqaluit. So, a hometown of 2 of our scholars, not by design, but by serendipity, wonderfully. But to have 4 or 5 days in a community and not leave, and have leaders of that community come in, scholars influencing our discussion, but also have community leaders come in and talk to us about what their needs are, what the challenges are, everything from heavy fuel oil and the cost of living to access to healthcare. So if a discipline or someone from a community is not on a panel, we have tried hard to get those perspectives there. Most of that comes from the very scholars working in the program. So we're trying to balance the reality with making sure that we're influencing and informing this. Because at the end of the day, our bottom line is actionable policy that we can give at the local, regional, national, international level, but also to build teams that don't end in another 8 months. Like our first Fulbright, we're hoping these teams stay together like the other team has to continue their work and their research and their publications. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
So thank you all for your very interesting presentations. I have a question for Sanne. Could you tell a bit more on how you plan to address your research questions? Are you using case studies and how have they been chosen, etc.?
Laura, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, maybe? Absolutely. My name is Laura Sokka. I work in VTT. It's a technical research center of Finland, and I took part in the first round of Fulbright Arctic Initiative.
Thank you.
I can say a little bit, yes. I have, I was just thinking, case studies in Greenland. I have an active mine and a proposed mine and infrastructure project. And then when I was in Anchorage, I was looking for an Alaskan case to do some comparison. So I have a mine in Alaska as well, so 4 case studies. And to begin with, it's about going through the documents. Yeah, I'm very happy with the Alaskan one, it's very long. But then also, following on to that, doing interviews, asking what happened in these processes. There are also, besides from the report itself, there are hearing statements and minutes from public meetings and so on that I'm going through. So that's sort of the first approach to it.
I should add that the scholars from the first round are acting as mentors and advisors and just general support and encouragement and sharing their experiences with the current cohort. And that's one way that we build a network of networks on networks, and that this program will have very long-term impact on the Arctic through these personal relationships and the enthusiasm that you're seeing up here. Do we have another question? If not, we're right on schedule. Oh, there is one. Thank you.
Just one, yes.
That's fine.
Victor from University of Oulu. I just, a question to Lara from Iceland. I heard my favorite combination of words. I do research also about oil spills in the Arctic, so can you please...
Can you speak up a little bit?
You didn't hear me? All right, 1-1, okay. Question about oil spills. Can you tell more about your research in this regard? Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, in my case, I'm looking at secondary data the information that I can find online, like reports and websites and news and so forth. But I found several lists that actually list the top 10 worst oil spills, and I selected data based on these spills, and then to figure out, okay, what could the worst case scenario look like based on all the information that I found regarding those spills. And this is what I bring together in like a table or sum up these findings, and that is a part of a paper that I've already submitted to a journal.
Well, thank you very much. So we're heading into a short break, but I definitely encourage you to be back, because what you're going to see is how these are sort of the ingredients. What happens when you put them together in these working groups? You know, what's the cake look like? So please come back. We'll have a dialogue on the group projects, and we'll have plenty of time for this kind of exchange. The questions have been terrific. And so we have 30 minutes for a break. There are refreshments in the back of the room, and time to mingle with the scholars and ask more questions. So 30 minutes. Thank you again, and thank the scholars. Just fantastic. Well, welcome back, everyone. And so what we'd like to do now is share with you sort of how the groups work. One of the tasks that Mike and I have as co-lead scholars was actually to pick out some organizing themes around which we thought we could engage a very diverse group of scholars interested in doing research that has impact and influences policy. So we came up with these two themes, resilient communities and sustainable economies. We thought that would pretty much capture everything, and potentially it can, which is also a big problem for the scholars, because there's 8 in each group, and their main task in coming together, and we got together for the first time in May in Iqaluit, was to figure out how to hone that down into something that was actionable and meaningful, and something that could be supported by their interests and their disciplines. So they've been working very hard. We do a lot of work online. They're using social media. This is only the second time. You know, we started in May in Iqaluit. Now here we are together. It's only the second time we've all been together as a group. So they've been working tremendously hard now to refine their work, think about the challenges and the issues and the opportunities. You're going to see presentations about the research directions that they've taken, some of the methods that are involved in that. You'll be able to see how they're already planning for impact, and most importantly, how do they do their research? How do they partner with peoples of the North in their research? And how they then share that research with the general public. What are the outcomes and products of this work? So each group's going to make a presentation so you can kind of see where they're at. Mike and I may have a couple of questions to start a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we had great questions, so I don't think we're going to have any trouble in engaging in a very active, energetic dialogue with this great group of scholars. So there they are. You see the two teams: resilient communities, sustainable economies. And I think the resilient folks are going to be resilient and start first. Is that correct? So we'll turn the platform over to you. The podium is yours.
Hey, or hey. I'm Gwen Healy Akiaro. I come from Iqaluit Nunavut, and our group is this is the clicker? Sorry. And we make up the Resilient Communities group. We're going to tell you a story about our interdisciplinary research and the processes that we use to collaborate. When our group of scholars first came together, we first met in person in my home community of Iqaluit last spring. And this was important to me, sharing my home and my context. I'm very proud of the community that I come from. When our leaders and community members came to address this lovely cohort, we were being addressed by my childhood friends and my mentors and my role models. So I think almost everyone also met my family, which was fun. In our discussions in Iqaluit, one element that we talked about was how the Arctic is portrayed in maps. In our work, we see many maps of the Arctic. In this example of Polinias and the Arctic region itself, there are no communities identified. There is no human element to the maps we often see of the Arctic. But the communities, the people, are why these maps are important. This region is our home, and we care very deeply about what happens here. Here is one, with communities identified, often in the name given by local community members. On this map, we've highlighted the communities we are from, and or the communities we are in service to and working with. In Iqaluit, we came together to begin our collaborative research process. We shared stories and experiences. We identified how we would work together as a group. And then we thought deeply about the term resilience and community perceptions and understandings of the term. We talked about its definition and its relevance in other languages around the Arctic. We talked about the human dimension and the use of the term resilience as it relates to people. What does it convey about us? What narrative or story does it tell to the world? Across disciplines, we agreed that it wasn't a term that really resonated with the work we do in our communities and the contexts we come from. There is a set of literature in the Arctic that is focused on resilience, and it is primarily through an ecosystem lens. We are focused on the human dimension and what our communities see as accurately capturing their perspectives. For example, some feel it's a lens applied from the outside, and others feel it's as if we walk out the door to go somewhere in the morning and somehow we are just surviving. But we are thriving. Our communities are brilliant, knowledgeable, and loving places. So one of our goals as a group of interdisciplinary scholars has been to reframe and retell the story about well-being in our communities, about resilience and what we as a group refer to as thriving communities. And this is the lens through which we see the work that my colleagues will tell you about.
Thank you, Gwen. So I am Jon Petter Stor, or Nils Ante Pietar. I'm from the Jukkasjärvi area, or Chakras, obviously, in northern Sweden. So, to continue, I think we're, in this group, we're all scholars who are community-driven, and we take a critical perspective. And for us, that means that if there is a dominant discourse we see in our respectively academic fields, we see it as our roles as scholars to try and find ways to challenge those dominant discourses from the community perspective. So, the types of questions that we are going to be interested in asking is, what's missing from the picture? What's missing from our discussions? What is it that we're not seeing? Will you press? So, to explain this a little bit better, I'm going to try to use the iceberg analogy, and I'm sure you're familiar with that one. It's that we just see the tip of the iceberg, right? And the bigger chunk is beneath the surface. It's below. So I will try and use two examples, and then Katie here will continue and tell you about some original research that we've already conducted. So in the first example, you can press. In the Arctic, there are numerous icebergs related to health and well-being. And by icebergs here, I mean that we've used health indicators, such as, for example, mortality rates. And through that, we've identified that certain populations in the north experience health or well-being disparities in relations to populations in the south. So, in general, that the populations of the north have worse health outcomes than populations in the south. In many of these Arctic contexts that we work, that discourse is so dominated that it's kind of overshadowing other kinds of perspectives. So, in order to get a more full picture of the health and well-being of people in the Arctic, I think we must dig deeper, or dive deeper, if you will. Go below the surface, basically. You can press. And what we discovered then might be, for example, that there are other ways, other health issues in the Arctic. For example, the experiences of good health, of good mental well-being, for example. And that might be the piece that we're not seeing, a strength-based approach. So in our work, the community members tell us about those kinds of pieces, and then we focus on issues like language, culture, spirituality, diversity, land use. So, another example then, you can press again. These icebergs related to health disparities in the north, we're not seeing them all across the Arctic. Actually, there are areas where we're seeing much fewer of those icebergs. So, for example, Sweden, in my home country, we're not seeing those icebergs. Academy is not reporting a great deal of health-related disparities. So that might, of course, be because there are no icebergs in Sweden. Perhaps the Baltic Sea just isn't big enough. But it might also be because we're not looking hard enough. They might be submerged. It might be that we're just not seeing them for some reason or other. And in this case, in many of the other Arctic contexts, indigenous people suffer disproportionately of those health disparities. But in Sweden, we're actually lacking that kind of data. We're not gathering data on indigenous health in Sweden. So, we're not actually using the research tools to discover those kinds of icebergs, right? There's no radar, no one's kind of on the lookout for icebergs. So to discover them, we need to act and think critically. So in order to declare Sweden iceberg-free, and I would really like to do that, we need to be allowed to gather empirical evidence. So in the Swedish case, that would mean that we need to acknowledge the indigenous people's right to know about their own health, because all communities and all people have that right. You can press again. And basically, what we're saying is that if icebergs are visible, we dig deeper or dive deeper, or if we're not seeing any icebergs, we go looking for them.
Thank you. My name is Katie Cueva, and my family is both from Mexico and Alaska, but I was born in, or Mexico and Canada, but I was born and raised in Alaska. And you can see a picture of me ice skating about an hour away from my home, out looking for some icebergs. Well, when we first came together, as Gwen shared, one of our initial reactions was to the term resilience, and we talked about how that didn't resonate for us and in the communities that we worked with. But we were curious if that was a sentiment that was shared by other people in the North. So at the International Congress on Circumpolar Health, we decided to facilitate a sharing circle to investigate ways that other people thought of the term resilience, and if there were ways that they wanted to imagine and refer to their communities. Now, a sharing circle is a methodology rooted in indigenous cultures that's been used for millennia. And a number of us in our group felt that a sharing circle was an appropriate methodological approach because it was something that we held in common, that many of us from diverse geographic contexts said that this was a method that was used in our communities. So we wanted to bring it to another Arctic context at this conference. And in a sharing circle, everyone sits in a circle. They're often called talking circles as well. And you go around the circle. Often a question is posed by someone that serves as both a facilitator and also participates. And each person is given the space to answer that question or to talk about things that that question or prompt allowed them to reflect on. And that space is often thought of as a sacred time, where that person gets the floor to speak their mind in whatever way they feel is appropriate. And each person has an equal opportunity to share. So there's no one dominating voice in a sharing circle. And in our sharing circle, we asked people what they thought of the term resilience. And we had a number of comments from people that resonated with us and with the conversations that we'd had before, where people felt it was an outside lens that was imposed on their context, on their communities, treating them almost as an object for investigation. And that also it was a term that made them feel tense. And one person said, we share a common philosophy, heart, spirit, and family. Is that what we want to talk about? Not resilience? And this is something that a number of people said, is that resilience, it feels as this is an adverse reaction. This is a reaction to something adverse. And maybe we want to be talking about the things that allow our communities to thrive. So people shared ways that they felt were important in their communities for us to know. They talked about things that made their communities great places to live. And they shared that there were terms like thriving, that they felt like described their communities, but things might be different in different contexts, that language might be different. One of our participants even shared that in a Finnish context, something like sisu was the term that they preferred to use when they referred to their own community. People also talked about diversity. They talked about the health of their communities, the kindness and humility of people within their communities, their own positive contribution to community and other people's positive contributions to their communities, and their connection to the land and their connection to harvesting as being things that made their communities great places to be. And we came together as participants in this Resilient Communities group, which we're rebranding as Thriving Communities. And we wrote down both a description of this methodology to share across the North and with other researchers, and also insights from this conference workshop. And several of our participants joined us in authoring this article. And it just was published the beginning of this month, and it's open access. You can go and take a look if you'd like.
Thank you. And I'm Christina Larsen, and I direct a center that's called Center for Public Health in Greenland. I'm based in Copenhagen, but we're situated both in Nuuk in Greenland and in Copenhagen. And Nuuk in Greenland really is my other hometown, so and that's where the research that I do comes from. And I'll be speaking to you about our group and some of the next steps that we're going to move into. And this is a picture of us just last weekend where we met outside of Oulu just before we came to, or no, sorry, outside of Helsinki before we started the Fulbright meeting. And what we've experienced as a group since May last year is that we can really move forward faster and much more focused when we work together. And that's what we experienced when we came together in Copenhagen to explore this community perspectives on thriving communities, the innovative methodological approach of the sharing circle that Katie just talked about. And our publication on this work just came out this month, as Katie said, and we really feel that we're able to do meaningful work rapidly because we're working together. And for all of you working in academia, you know that doing the research and writing it up and actually getting it published within half a year is pretty fast, and that's definitely due to the group dynamic and doing meaningful work. And we want to build on this momentum. We also all bring our networks to the group. Ross already mentioned this, and this is, I think, a particular important part of the Fulbright experience, that it really expands all of our networks when we work together and combine all these relationships and networks. So moving forward, these are themes that we would like to explore together on the work we do with thriving communities. Ethical considerations, Arya also talked about this. We share your feeling that this is important. Community-driven models, community-engaged processes, system-level governance, methodological innovations, and strength-based approaches. And the framework for this research is actually this iceberg. Petter already talked to you about it. This is another version of it that's more the general model that we're using. So there's the monitoring, there's a large assessment of health and wellness that you see above the surface. And then this needs to be combined with an understanding of what is going on beneath the surface. So we're asking questions such as, what is the context and the community perspective for health and wellness? How do community perspectives differ? What does it look like between communities, between Arctic regions? And what is the in-depth understanding and knowledge about the determinants of health and wellness in these communities and regions? And this same framework will guide a set of policy recommendations that we're working on, where we want to be action-oriented. We want to focus on the how we explore community perspectives, how we do community-driven research, how we implement a strength-based approach, and so on. We also do think that it's important that we come together, that we do work together in person, as we've had the chance to do this week, and spend as much time together as we can. As a product, we're planning to do a special issue in a journal together, and that this will be with the other group as well, and try to get manuscripts in there that reflects the individual projects, but also the group work that we're doing. And on the screen, these are upcoming conferences where we're planning to meet and present our Fulbright work, engage in more interdisciplinary discussions. So there's the Nunavut conference that I can advertise from my own region. It's a Greenlandic health conference. Everyone's welcome to join. It's in early October. And there's the Arctic Circle Assembly in Iceland in mid-October. And then, of course, we'll meet at our final Fulbright meeting in December, which is also in October. It's going to be a busy month. So I'll end our group presentation by saying thank you from all of us. We really want to thank Fulbright Finland for hosting us, for putting together such an engaging program. Thank you. We also want to thank, of course, Fulbright for giving us this amazing opportunity to explore together and to visit other parts of the Arctic world and learn. And we want to thank Mike and Ross for guiding us through this jungle of opportunities, but also a lot of fun. So thank you very much.
And we thank you. So that was wonderful. So we're going to hear from the next group, the working group on sustainable economies. We started with resilience, and that word was kind of shifted, moved to now, right, thriving. So I'm curious to see what the next group does with sustainability.
Yes, hi, I'm Soili, and I come from the University of Lapland, Finland, the Faculty of Law. And I'm going to start this presentation of our, the joint presentation of our Sustainable Economies group. And you may wonder why we have risk here in the beginning and not sustainable economies. So it's actually, there's already it's already common knowledge that that there are a lot of economic opportunities in the Arctic up there, and there's also a discussion that climate change will open possibilities, new possibilities to use the resources of the Arctic. But it has to be remembered that there are a lot of uncertainties involved. And that's why we think that it is very important to talk about risk. Yes, we actually it wasn't really easy for our team. It was also difficult because you know, sustainable economies is such a broad term for a multidisciplinary team, and we have all different approaches, but then this lenses of risk is seem to be something that we have in common and everybody could agree on it. Now it seems somehow obvious that we chose this risk, but it wasn't in the beginning. We actually struggled before we came to this conclusion. So risks need to be addressed for a sustainable Arctic. Yes, so there are a lot of different types of risks. Risks can be economic, political, financial, environmental, a lot of different types of risks. And risks are also always case specific. But we still think that there needs to be some kind of a holistic approach to risk. And that's why we started to use this this sliding scale idea for studying risks. So there can be like risks for which are risks for subsistence economy, like hunting, fishing, whaling, to some extent even reindeer herding, or they can be risks to a market economy, or from the point of view of a market economy. Then there are a lot of risks. Risks can be individual, they can be risks for a family, community, company, or then they can be systemic risks, like Lara is for instance studying systemic risks. Then there are risks which are local. Actually, a lot of industrial projects they pose risks on local communities, environmental and whatever risks. But then there are also global risks. And now you are going to hear about a couple of cases which we are going to present to you. They are quite different cases, but they have also a lot in common. And we use this, our fine scaling here. And the first case is Jelena Gladun from Tumen University is going to present the first one. So please, Jelena.
Hello, my name is Elena and I'm from Russia. And my case here is to show that the transformation of the Arctic because of global warming, open access, not only puts the Arctic environment at risks, but has some wider impacts. And what is more, risks just not only appear, they are changing. And these changes bring more, or create more challenges and opportunities, and we need to estimate them holistically, especially for the indigenous population. Traditional economies like harvested foods, reindeer herding continue to play a major role in the economic, social, cultural life in many indigenous peoples, for many indigenous peoples and local communities. And that is true for Yamal region as well. Like in Yamal, local traditional economies have been subsistent for 1,000 years, and even now 40% of indigenous population still leads a traditional nomadic life. But sharing their traditional territories with major Russian oil and gas companies provide them new trade and support opportunities, and their economies gradually change into market type. 100 years ago, smaller herds and camps of nomadic population were able to respond more flexibly to environmental changes, and because they could exploit bigger pastures, smaller households and communities. And they, in this way, developed quite smart and innovative ways to adapt. But now, indigenous peoples are increasingly finding themselves in the situation when their knowledges, experience, and practices cannot help them, and risks are gradually changing from individual to systemic level. Globalization also has become quite a challenge for indigenous peoples, as their traditional system of values is being actively reviewed. Yamal indigenous peoples are still rather remote and local compared to other northern communities, and we can find them like at some local level. But however, global values like rationality, consumption values, the desire for material well-being are spreading wider and wider even in these territories. At the same time, such values as community teamwork, respect for elders, mutual support, and other are being actively displaced and lost. And these are global trends, and they influence Arctic community even in such remote place as Yamal region. Thus, today we face many risks associated with indigenous peoples. Loss of territories which are very diverse and have ecological and cultural significance, unpredictable growth of herds, which is driven not only by sustainable but market values. And at the same time, we see low quality of life of indigenous people. Just a few examples here. Growing herds and unpredictable environmental changes combined cause stressful results. That is the example of moss icing and mass reindeer die-off in Yamal in 2013, 2015, anthrop in 2017. All this endanger both reindeer and people. The primary objective of our group, and for the society and for the governments as well, is to find solutions. But these solutions should be based on identifying and assessing all potential risks, environmental, social, cultural, and economic. Are there any alternative ways for indigenous economic development? What can indigenous economies, how can they be more sustainable? Answering these and many other questions through risk lens may contribute to the Arctic sustainable development. And I'm giving the floor to another case, which is introduced by Ellie.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ellie Bors. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at Oregon State University in the United States. You've been an excellent audience. Those of you online are particularly well behaved. So I am a marine biologist. I study fish and fisheries, and I'm going to try to relate some of this to risk and our topic in our group. So when I'm talking today, I'm really focusing on commercial fisheries. So here we see on the economic scale, we're really focusing on market economies. The level at which risk is occurring varies. So you can imagine an individual level of risk to a fisherman or a boat owner. But we also have industry level risk, so more in that middle of the scale. And then in terms of spatial scale, mostly I'm thinking about sort of a fishery within a country or within one of the water basins here. And my task today is actually very easy because in many ways fisheries management is risk management. So at a very, very basic level, we ask questions like, how many fish can we catch this year so that we can catch fish next year and the following year and the year after that? How can we catch fish without damaging critical ecosystems? And how can we do both of those things while maintaining livelihoods? And people who are working in this field specifically often have to balance these sometimes conflicting goals of managing a fishery. And so in some ways you can sort of imagine that fisheries science is like a risk assessment type process, and fisheries management is sort of like risk management. And in the Arctic specifically, I would argue that there are two dominant aspects of risk. The first being the degree of climate change and the rate at which the environment is changing. And so on the left here, you see a figure just showing the annual, how every year the Arctic is warming. And these changes have consequences for fish biology and likely will lead to changes in the distribution and the number of fish in different regions. And then the second force, I would argue, is uncertainty, and in some cases extreme uncertainty in terms of knowledge of the system. And so I've sort of been saying Arctic fisheries and fisheries in the Arctic, but we have to acknowledge that there is a huge diversity of commercial fisheries. I'm not even talking about all the other important levels at which people are catching fish, but thinking about commercial fisheries, comparing something like fisheries in the Barents Sea to fisheries in the US Arctic, where we don't have any proper commercial fisheries in the Arctic waters. Versus, Norwich has a very established, many established fisheries. And then we can think also here, you can see the outline in the central Arctic Ocean, which is the high seas part of the Arctic. This is a region where in the last couple of years there's been agreement and an international negotiation process to agree not to fish in these high seas for the next 16 years because we simply don't know enough about the science and the fish there to responsibly manage fisheries on the high seas in the Arctic. And so this is a case where we have extreme uncertainty, and the response from the policy community and the international community has been to put basically a moratorium and say, we're not going to fish until we know more. So I think that's a very powerful example of how uncertainty plays out in management in the Arctic. So you've seen these two cases. They're fairly different, but hopefully we've shown you that there are aspects of risk that play out in both. And I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Daria, who's really going to help us zoom out and think a bit more about our group level and what our next directions are.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you also, Elena and Soili, and a shout out to Svetlana, Lara, Todd, and Sanne, our brilliant team. My name is Daria. I'm a public policy scholar from the University of Helsinki. And as you have seen, in our group, we cover really very diverse activities. We are talking about indigenous economies, fisheries, maritime activities, large infrastructure governance, energy development. And up until now, our focus has been on exploring these diverse situations and working on the common language. And this common language has been the language of risk. Despite the differences, the risk perspective affords us to map out important features that these situations have in common. That is the global change in the Arctic, by which we mean the rate and scale of climatic change, the changes and shifts in demographics and migration patterns, and globalization and integration of the Arctic in the global production networks, the uncertainty that pertains to data, but also to models and our understanding of causality, of dependencies and interdependencies, as well as the state of the future, both the one that will actualize and the one that we desire. And finally, the element and the crucial trade-offs between the market and subsistence economies, those non-monetary activities on which many Arctic communities are thriving. The conceptual framework that we have put together has proven very helpful in identifying, mapping out, and understanding how risk assessment and management can be an inherent part in making the Arctic economies more sustainable in the future. We're halfway through our Fulbright project, and in the second half, our goal is to synthesize the knowledge from our individual projects and put it forward into the different types of products and packages that can be and should be, in our opinion, of interest to various stakeholders across the Arctic. We already started our work of mapping out some of them, and we are constantly continuing this work. And if you have any good ideas of who we should also contact, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we will include these organizations and individuals into our list. Our next step is to devise a framework that will allow better integration of sustainability thinking in risk assessment and management procedures, specifically in the Arctic. And after this talk, we would be very glad also to hear from you and to engage with you in the conversations about your experiences with Arctic projects and risk assessment and management. We would like to hear from you with regard to how these tools can be made better and more actionable in order to make the Arctic economies more sustainable in the future. We also, of course, want to thank the Fulbright Foundation, the Fulbright Finland, everyone who has enabled us to work as a group, has created these brilliant conditions here in Finland, but also over this whole period of time. And obviously a shout out to Mike and Ross. We are grateful for this opportunity, and we really hope to pay back in our intellectual capacity. And we are looking forward to the second half of this Fulbright experience. Thank you.
First off, that was amazing and wonderful to see, and watching the groups come together and the progress you've made in a very short period of time is I think, unusual and to be commended. So I also enjoyed the ways that you shifted resilience to thriving, and how the other group matched that by taking sustainable and moving it into risk. So we gave them instructions, and they immediately said, no, this is a better way to do this. But also it's a very impactful way. This is an important discussion in the academic community. And they already have one paper out, and I'm sure the risk paper will also begin to shift the way in which people use these research frameworks. And by shifting that dialogue, you'll have very large impact on the stakeholders you're trying to reach. And this Fulbright research is really about research that's applied to the needs of people and has policy impact. So that's the backdrop for what the groups are trying to do. So I think that you've sort of, the plate's been laid out. There's all these ideas and concepts put forward. So why don't we just really turn directly to the audience and see if you have questions, advice, comments. There's already some thought about how these groups might come together on some new questions, what they might be. So I think we have a microphone circulating, and please don't be shy. We'd love to have an open dialogue here.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you. I'm Susanna Päkälä. I'm coming from Rovaniemi, from the Arctic Center. And I have been very happy to be able to be participating in the same summer school with Jon Petter, right? Okay, in Oulu a couple of years ago. And we had nice discussions about mental health that time. It was the theme that year. Arja was there guiding us. And I would like to ask you now that, what do you think at the moment, what are the biggest problems in the communities in the North at the moment? Is it still mental health?
So I'll be very happy to respond to that. You are asking a clinical psychologist if there's mental health problems. There sure is. There sure is. I'd say that's one of the major problems, absolutely. And mental health is connected to everything. It's no wonder you mentioned mental health in the One Health slide, Arja, because it really is connected to all kinds of issues. So I wrote a plan for suicide prevention among Sami in northern Sweden, Finland, and Norway a few years ago, and we have all kinds of connections in there, including the connection to self-determination and indigenous rights. So that's my response.
If no one else from the audience, from the stage would like to comment, no, I have time for your question, trust me. But I want to underscore one thing, and that is that the importance about talking about mental health and suicide prevention, things that we just as a society, maybe globally, haven't talked about, certainly in the North, in small communities. That is a very difficult discussion to have. And the fact that we're even talking about it here, that it's come up over and over, that it's being addressed, just that issue alone is important for us to realize, recognize, and address. So these dialogues are helpful, the research is profound, but simply the discussions that happened now in communities across the North, I think are very important. Of course, the research and the analysis and the application of good preventative medicines and interventions, but just doing this is important. Would you agree or not agree? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. We're going to go back here.
It's okay.
Please.
Jon Petter, first of all, I really would like to thank you as a Sami, that you have addressed this really current and an important topic that has so great impacts on our indigenous societies. So what I want to ask from you is that what you think are the future implications of your study?
Thank you, Ologihtu. I, of course, also think it's very important. I suppose the future implications would have to include, acknowledging the Sami people's right to equal health. And that will have to include, and now drawing the line back to José's presentation earlier, that would have to include adapting services. They're going to have to be culturally and language-wise adapted to our needs.
Can we, before we move on, I just want to comment.
Yes, of course. Christine, do you want to respond?
It's related to the second comment also, and actually within suicide prevention in the Arctic, the word resilience has also had a meaning. So for many years we only talked about suicide prevention, and then actually in 2009 when I was living in Nuuk, we had a conference. So it was about suicide prevention, but it was a conference that was called Hope and Resilience. So within that area of mental health, I think that we try to shift the dialogue and then look to the strength-based approach also. And as a part of the Finnish chairmanship, we actually had a project, the Creates, that Arja also mentioned, and that's engaging youth in that discussion. So that's taking it even further, that then we had been discussing hope and resilience for a long time about youth, but youth weren't really included. So now, the next step has been to try to include youth also and put them at the front of that discussion around not suicide, but hope, wellness, thriving, the strength, and look to the strength in the youth that's already there. So now that we don't acknowledge that it's an issue, and I think we should keep talking about it, but also building on the strength-based focus that we've already touched upon.
I'd like to sort of follow up on that and ask, as a researcher who's doing work in the south of the United States and particularly in rural areas, I'm really interested in this strength-based model, and I share a lot of your ideas, and I work with communities where that really resonates with them too. And I'm interested in your sense of whether there is a tension or even a risk in when we are trying to communicate with policymakers, and often we have to do things in kind of, sound bites or short memos. How to balance using strength-based approaches, but calling attention to problems that need to get solved. And I was particularly interested in this notion of thriving communities. If we say this is a thriving community, why should anyone pay attention, right? Like, it seems to me a tension there between a need for more resources, a need for policymakers' attention, and this notion of being a thriving community. And I'm just wondering how you balance that and how you suggest that we use that framework.
I'm Gwen again. So in my work, I run a community-led health research center in Iqaluit, and I co-founded the center with one of our late elders. And our center grew out of a climate of research happening in our communities that was problem-based and disease-focused. And so our center was a response to the fact that we couldn't see ourselves in the work that was being conducted, and a kind of a larger climate of information just leaving and not coming back, or not being used in a way that we needed to use it. And so I think for us, it's this lens of thriving communities is to just challenge the dominant discourse. We're not saying it replaces it, but we're challenging it. And we're trying to frame things in a way that our communities see themselves in the work that we do. And that, opens up a whole variety of opportunity to talk about innovations and solutions and ways of communicating with our policy and decision makers that results in, hopefully, relevant policy decisions that people can see themselves in. So that's the perspective I'm coming from, and typically that's, I think, I'm looking for nods from our other group members that we are approaching our work with. So just challenging it, reshaping it, adding more things to talk about, more lenses?
Thanks for your question. I understand and I see your tension between those two things. And I think, as Gwen mentioned, that it's a challenge to the discourse and a way to shift that narrative. And even thinking about how, when I write a paper or when I write a grant, sometimes there's a need to put in information about disparities, but even including that wasn't part of the narrative not so very long ago. So I think that these things can change, and it's not necessarily a quick process, but it's something that we can continue to push until the conversation becomes around thriving communities. Also, as Gwen mentioned, these two concepts are not mutually incompatible. That you can talk about how a community is thriving and how there are aspects that make that community great that can address some of the disparities that exist in a particular community or region.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Middleton from University of Oulu Business School, and I'd like to ask a question about risk assessment and how do you operationalize the measurability of this risk? Is there enough data and resources, and how did you do in your preliminary research?
Dive in.
Okay, probably I could start. Our best informed person on risk assessment is right now over there, Lara, who actually has, so that is why we had a little bit of a look around. But I probably just could start on this topic. So yes, indeed. And if we think about risk, in a way it has components. And one of them is that component of the probability, and the other one is the component of severity. And yet, so now it gets very interesting, because the probabilities, they are thought of as strictly mathematical and calculable units. So we need data in order to calculate probabilities. And this is indeed something that has become very clear in our individual projects, that in many cases, the uncertainty is so high, the data available is so little that it's very difficult to calculate probabilities. I name you just a few examples. What Ellie was talking about with the fish stocks, where we just simply don't know. Then in my work on insurance for the shipping sector, that also comes up. Just so little shipping has been happening that we don't have these centuries of records that we have in other oceans. We just don't know. So there is this aspect, but there are ways of tackling this uncertainty. So though we don't have the data, we have the knowledge of the uncertainty, and this is the part of the probability. We cannot maybe always calculate the probabilities, but there is a way, or there must be a way, or there should be a way of taking on board the uncertainty, and this is what Sanne was talking about in her work. And then on the other hand, we have the severity of risk. And this is something that, in our opinion, is related to different worlds and different understandings of what is important, what is valuable, and how valuable is it, and to whom. And this is something that we are trying to unpack in our work through drawing on the continuum between market and subsistence activities and all kind of mixtures of these activities that are in between. And in our opinion, exactly bringing these understandings to the contemporary practices of risk management and assessment could be that avenue that would make it more Arctic specific and to operationalize it.
So thank you very much for the part of the groups, but the risk issue is so important. We have 2 days workshop in the beginning of June. about the risk, about the economical risk, regional developmental risk, anthropological way, technical and health risk, putting together. And I think that this very nicely shows that we need to new types of tools to have more concrete way to also to give the information to the, of course, the local people, but also the policymakers somehow to come over those numbers, because we need this kind of calculations and other things. But this is a very important work you are doing, and it's difficult, and that's very fascinating, I think.
I can continue a bit. Daria already said that we are also trying to challenge here, like the other team is challenging this resilience, the concept. We are trying to challenge this, that risks are usually assessed from the point of view of a market economy. So we are trying to somehow broaden it. Yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
No, come on.
Okay, Laura, please. This is good. One group, the other group.
No, thank you to both of the groups, but I was just thinking after listening to both of these presentations, if there are opportunities for reproduction or something like this in between the groups. So just a short comment on this.
I think if it's a reproduction issue, we should ask Beth.
Again, the words that we choose are
very important.
Yeah. Well, I think, that actually, so go ahead. Please.
I was just going to say, in terms of cross-fertilization, I think that we have talked a lot, and I think Arya actually just mentioned that within the context of the risk framework that there are, of course, applications towards health, and thinking even from sort of this One Health perspective, right? Environmental risk is also risk to humans and human health. And we've also had some discussions, I think, on our end. We have sort of mentioned and played around with and thought about and tried to conceptualize a lot of issues of the local scale and the community scale and those perspectives. But to be honest, we don't have as much experience in that realm as the other group at all. And so I think we will benefit a lot from sort of the perspective there. And I think earlier when we were discussing one of the many wonderful discussions we've had this week, this issue of sort of lenses and perspectives and thinking sort of top-down or system funneling in versus bottom-up. I also really don't like the top and bottom of that, but sort of broad to there's really no way to not have loaded language here, but sort of like a bigger, broader funneling in or funneling out, I guess. And I think that that's something we can really help each other with moving forward.
No one else had anything else to that? Okay. Well, maybe that's a really good place to bookmark here for a little bit, because we're challenged, as we said before, with just the scale of the issues that need to be addressed in the Arctic, and how we approach the work of the Fulbright, how we stretched it from just one Fulbright scholar doing their work and going abroad, to a team approach, including both of those, and then looking at this third component, which is the third part of a Venn diagram within this Fulbright structure, which is, I think, to this question, is that we have individual Fulbrights, we have two groups, but then how these groups work together and influence each other's work. And that's our challenge coming up for the next X months. And I think that is why the first group continues to work to this day, now 2-3 years later, because there is so much work to do. And I think Ross and I, in our nirvana, we would like to see this Fulbright working with the former Fulbright together, because that's an even more complex, more difficult way to go about it. But it reflects the Arctic. It is a lot going on within a region, just like other places around the globe. But a lot of this to communities is relatively new. There is so much happening so fast in a world that now has produced a global Arctic, not that mythical place somewhere else. We knew it was there, but now the rest of the world is exposed to the Arctic, and that feedback loop has begun, and it is quickening. And so we are challenged with setting up a framework for scholars to do their work, but then inform the work across disciplines and across the different Venns of that diagram. So we'll continue to work on that. And this isn't happening in isolation. There are groups doing work like this. The University of the Arctic was mentioned over and over. That is a great part of our effort, is to link efforts like this with other networks around the North and elsewhere. There is a lot of work happening in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean, that if you took out that map and inserted it with a different map, it would be the same issues, relatively same issues. And so we look to how we then influence each other on this global scale as well. So that was part of Ross and I thinking through sort of how does this now grow and evolve, but most of all institutionalize. How does this work not be a one-off and then you're done with papers, that actually the work continues and this network continues. Did you want to say anything else to that, Ross?
Yeah, I think, well, I want to go back to Arya's talk about networks, but she sort of ended with the Arctic family. And I think that's such a beautiful concept, because that's what this is here, is really a group of scholars coming together and becoming a family. And I think you can already see that chemistry is here and there, and it carries over, and the standard was set by the first group. So this network of networks of collegiality and challenging research and being not afraid. I mean, that's kind of, they're fearless. They're taking apart these paradigms and shuffling them back and forth. And they're already planning new research together based on the crosstalk between these two working groups. They're ambitious, and it's creative, and it's working well, and it's amazingly well supported by Fulbright Finland, Canada, and then Fulbright at the State Department. So it's an amazing experiment, and I think it's probably really not, we're hoping it's not just an experiment, that it becomes part of the fiber of the way we do research in the Arctic. And we're just amazingly privileged to be involved in this from the start, and we thank everyone for that opportunity.
So before we do our closing remarks, would you please thank our scholars here from these two groups? Thank you very much. So as you've heard over and over as we conclude, it's taken a village, it's taken a family to make this Fulbright occur, and actually to create the idea of a Fulbright Arctic initiative. Why was the Arctic Fulbright created just a few years ago, a brand new Fulbright within the State Department? Why? For many of the reasons you heard today. And it takes many people, and you've heard their names and their titles, but within every organization, every structure, every effort, there's always the person, the go-to person, the person that in the middle of everything else, you can count on that one person. We have that one person who has been with us from the very, very beginning. So I get to introduce our friend, Steve Money. Steve is the Deputy Director, the Office of Academic Exchange Programs at the U.S. State Department. That's a new title for Steve, but it reflects his passion for the work that we do, many years in the State Department, and I can tell you, and I think Ross absolutely agrees, that Steve had the most fascinating name when we were appointed co-lead scholars, because they told us, if you want to create the program and get the money, call Steve Money. And we thought, is there a Steve Money, or is this
real?
But there is a Steve Money, and we are all better because there is a Steve Money. So we would like to introduce to the podium our friend and colleague, and the one person we always go to, Steve Money.
Here's Steve.
Which way am I going? That's me. Well, thank you, Mike and Ross, for your leadership of this amazing cohort of incredible scholars. And greetings to everyone here in the audience, here today in Oulu and watching online. I'm very privileged to close today's excellent symposium. As Mike said, my name is Steve Money. I work at the U.S. Department of State in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And my bureau has the very special mission to build friendly, peaceful relations between the people of the United States and the people of other countries through academic, cultural, sports, and professional exchange programs. In that bureau, I work on the Global Fulbright program, which is the US government's flagship international educational exchange program. Since its start in 1948, the Fulbright program has an outstanding record of academic achievement and international collaboration, providing grants now to more than 390,000 participants from over 150 countries, with the opportunity to study, teach, and conduct research, exchange ideas, and contribute to finding solutions to shared international concerns. Fulbright alumni include 59 Nobel Prize winners and 37 heads of state or government, and this is a very large gathering of Fulbrighters, so who knows what future Nobel Prize winners are in the room. Primary funding for the Fulbright program comes from the American people through their tax dollars, but we work in partnership with governments around the world, many of which share funding for the program, and that includes here in Finland, and we're very glad to have the partnership of the Finnish government. We also work with non-governmental organizations and with the academic community. So Fulbright really represents a partnership of governments, private organizations, academic institutions, participants, and alumni throughout the world, and that truly makes it a global program. Even after 73 years of history, the Fulbright program continues to strive to be dynamic and relevant to the lives of individuals, communities, and countries. I think public diplomacy programs like Fulbright have to be able to quickly respond to global challenges. And one immediate need is to focus attention on the very real and immediate changes happening in the Arctic and the impacts of those changes on the environment, on communities, and on the Arctic economy. And it was this need that prompted my bureau to establish the Fulbright Arctic Initiative during the US chairmanship of the Arctic Council in 2015. By bringing together a diverse group of scholars and scientists from all 8 Arctic nations to work together in a cross-discipline way, we hope to stimulate collaborative research that would be accessible to a wide public audience and relevant to Arctic communities and policymakers. The outcome of the first Arctic initiative really exceeded our expectations. The scholars produced a number of original publications, policy recommendations, and built partnerships and networks that continue to actively engage even now several years after their program has ended. I think that was demonstrated today. And we have 2 alumni from the first cohort here with us in Oulu acting as mentors, Laura Soukka from Finland and Oystein Varpe from Norway. And I want to thank them for being here. It was their success and that of their fellow Round 1 scholars that prompted the decision to convene a second cohort of Arctic scholars. And you can see from their presentations here today that these new scholars are carrying on the legacy and setting themselves a very high goal of producing research that will benefit the Arctic communities that they represent and be relevant to national and international policymakers. This gathering in Oulu represents the midpoint of their program, and we're so glad you could all be here today to learn about their ongoing research, and I hope that you'll continue to engage with them. This has been a great audience of students, scholars, Fulbright alumni, and current Fulbright grantees from around Finland, and I want to thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this symposium and want to be among the first to hear the final conclusions and recommendations from these scholars, I invite you to join us in Washington, D.C. in October for Fulbright Arctic Week, when the scholars will showcase their scholarship, public outreach, and policy-relevant findings in a series of public events and celebrations at venues in the U.S. Capitol. And while we're already looking ahead to October, we obviously cannot leave Oulu without first thanking everyone who made this week and this event so successful. First, I want to thank our hosts at the University of Oulu, particularly Jouko Niinimäki, Arja Rautio, and Kirsi Latola, who have been strong supporters of this Fulbright initiative and of international collaborative research more generally through the work that they do with the University of the Arctic. Thank you. I would also like to thank our friends at the Fulbright Finland Foundation who planned this midterm meeting, especially CEO Terhi Mosa, Maija Kettunen, Mirke McIntyre, Emil Lekainen, and the rest of their team who have been working to put this week together for nearly a year. Thank you very much. We're also deeply grateful to the city of Oulu for the welcome and the government of Finland, including the Office of the President, the Parliament, and the Foreign Ministry for their support of Fulbright and for the time they took this week to meet with our scholars in Helsinki during this busy time of the Finnish chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Lastly, I want to thank Greta Scharnweber from the Institute of International Education and her colleagues for their work to support this program and all of its activities during the 18 months of this program. Finally, before closing, I want to invite all of you to stay connected with this program through social media, where we continue the discussion started in Oulu today to find ways to translate research into action and help shape the future of the Arctic. So thank you for being here. Thank you for those watching online. Farewell for now from Fulbright Arctic, and we will see you in October in Washington. Thank you.